Welcome everybody to the Alfred Research Alliance Research Week keynote address, an annual event, which I have to say has been somewhat corrupted by COVID, like many other things this year, but thanks to great work from Renee, Robin and others, we've been able to forge on ahead and present a virtual address to largely an empty lecture theatre, but a very substantial online audience, which I have heard includes viewers from the United States, Germany and other countries. So welcome to our international friends and of course friends within Melbourne and the rest of Australia. I'd just like to acknowledge that wherever you are in Australia, you're meeting on the traditional lands of the custodians of the Indigenous population, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We really are delighted today to present our keynote speaker, and that is Professor Allen Cheng. And you probably couldn't get a more topical speaker for today because Allen has become a nightly feature on our television sets, on the news bulletins as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Victoria, an incredibly important role, of course, during the pandemic, and particularly given the fact that Melbourne and Victoria was one of the most heavily affected states in the country and have really, I think, mounted a world-leading response to the challenges faced by a community with a pandemic, where we went from a number of, I think, around 700 cases down to 0 cases for the last 16 days. The envy of many places in the world, I think, and Allen has obviously been instrumental in this, in the advice he's given with the other Chief Medical Officer and advisors to our government about how we deal with such a catastrophic situation. Allen, in his other life, is an infectious diseases physician. He works at the Alfred. He also works in the School of Public Health and Preventative Medicine. He has done many things in his career in terms of his infectious diseases profile. He's worked in metropolitan, regional and remote areas and internationally. He's had many grants, obviously a tremendous publication record, and has had major interests in influenza and pneumonia, antimicrobial resistance and other challenges of our times in terms of the infectious diseases space. As I mentioned, he's been unbelievably busy, so we're incredibly grateful that he's given us his time to come and speak to us today on the challenges that have faced us all with COVID. And the second part of the presentation today is the recognition of the best publications at the precinct, and after Allen's talk and question time, we'll move to present the research awards for the outstanding publications from the precinct for the previous year. So again, without further delay, I'd like to invite Allen to the podium and thank him again for giving up his precious time to speak to us today. Thanks so much, Allen.
Thanks very much, Steve, and it is thanks very much to all the Renee and all the organisers for organising this. It is a bit more of an effort to have one of these addresses in that's held virtually, and we'll remember the grand round that we had earlier in the year where it was completely packed and the penny dropped in the middle of it that maybe we probably shouldn't be having those sorts of events. It'd be fair to say that So it'd be fair to say that, I was joking with my wife that, the question they always ask in job interviews about where do you see yourself in 5 years, I'd probably be the most incorrect if I'd been asked that. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is about Australia's response to COVID-19, and then in particular the lessons learned from the Victorian second wave. Just going to talk about the COVID vaccines and the vaccine program that's planned, and then some personal reflections on what's been happening. Thanks. So Just a reminder, Australia has a lot of advantages in being a wealthy nation on the edge of the world, but there are a certain number of disadvantages that we had, and in particular, we're one of the top 20 destinations for Chinese travellers, and had early cases of COVID back in late January. Obviously our governance structure in Australia is quite unusual, and at the moment we're functioning like 8 separate jurisdictions with different public health capacities and different governance structures, so the policies made by jurisdictions are quite different. We are quite a diverse population. Obviously that's a strength, but obviously a vulnerability as well in communicating to all those populations, and we've always been quite worried about the impact of pandemics on our Indigenous populations, and particularly in remote communities. And I think that the economic changes that have occurred elsewhere in the world have also affected Australia, so we have an increasingly casualised workforce. Next. Thanks. So this is reflected in our public health governance. So rather than having a CDC or an ECDC, as they have in other regions, we really have this committee structure with National Cabinet, and then the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee below that is comprised of the Chief Health Officers of the various states and territories, and then some technical committees underneath that. And very early on, we activated a national incident response and developed a response plan based on the influenza plan. Thanks. So we had our first wave, and I think I was in the room when the decision was made to close the border to China, and that really, I think, was, that probably seems fairly, an uncontroversial decision now, but I do remember at the time that was sort of really feeling the weight of that decision, and all the thousands of people that would impact on. There were obviously a lot of Australians overseas in China, and weren't able to get home at that time. So for a hospital clinician to make a decision that really affected that many people was really a major piece of advice to give to government. And to the credit, government did accept that advice. I think the decision was made in the morning, and by 9 o'clock the border had been closed. The other thing the first wave did tell us is that control was possible. So obviously a lot of the decrease in cases in the first wave was just shutting the border, and the decrease in number of people with infection coming in. But there was community transmission at that time, and our first wave was really, the first lockdown was really showed that we could control this. And then the wheels fell off, unfortunately, in about mid-June. So maybe a little bit difficult to see, but on the right is the genomic data, and what you can see at the bottom part, and that's just a small proportion of all the genomic data that's there, is that there were small clusters that were generated. So these small dots at the bottom were the international travellers coming in and transmitting to people within Australia, and then you can see that they all extinguish. So this is like an Ember attack, where cases were coming in, and then they were extinguished by public health action. There was this second cluster. So at Cedar Meats, where there was more of a transmission, but again that one extinguished, and then at the top you can see another cluster here where that was extinguished, but then there was this escape from Ridges Hotel, which really resulted in a number of cases. And you can even see that this is the cases that came in from overseas, and then these were the first cases that came in security guards and in other staff in the hotels. And so in Victoria, we've had this major second wave that really most other states haven't seen. New South Wales have had some cases resulting from the Victorian cases, but very few in other jurisdictions in Australia. And the outbreak settings have really been, all these vulnerable settings, so aged care, disability facilities, hospitals, schools, and then a lot of high-risk workplaces. So meat and food processing, cold storage and distribution facilities. And there's a lot of reasons for this, not only the setting, but also the populations that work in them. Culturally and linguistically diverse communities. A lot of these are essential workers, so they, even after a lot of other industry had shut down, these are the industries that still need to be going to provide essential services. There's a lot of involvement of the elderly in residential care, and obviously that's where a lot of the mortality was. And then a lot of these people were living in crowded situations, so public housing, there were international students involved, and also quite large households. So some of the things we learned was about the importance of community engagement, you know, Melbourne is quite diverse, and these, even within these groups, they're not defined necessarily by the language they speak or their culture. They can be quite heterogeneous even within that. So, you know, in my community, in the Chinese community, there's people like me who barely speak Chinese and you know, first generation, and that's very different to how you might communicate with an international student or an older person. And there was you know, certainly a lot of what we might call newer communities, so not in the top 5 languages or the top 5 ethnic groups, a lot of very small communities and more newer arrivals, and these are the ones that were affected in those essential industries. What we did find was that some of these localised responses were much more helpful, so having local public health units, and particularly those that had pre-existing links to these communities. So, for example, Monash Health, with their refugee health services, had a lot of links to some of these communities, and then the importance of involving primary care where that was possible. I think government is generally used to telling people what to do rather than trying to have a two-way communication, and there's been a lot of work to try and co-design and to try and make sure that there is a dialogue with communities. The second learning was really about the rapid responses that were needed in a lot of these places, so particularly aged care and disability care are not places that are used to dealing with emergencies, and often the first step that's taken in an outbreak is to send all their staff home and into quarantine. So just trying to find a workforce was really important. It was really important to make sure that the people that are in care facilities were getting care and involving health services in that. But even just a lot of the simple things, the logistics, who takes out the waste, who orders the PPE and who does the cleaning, was a really important aspect of this response. For high-risk workplaces, there were our occupational health colleagues were very helpful and working with the outbreak squads, and there were lots of really tricky little problems to find solutions to. So, for example, in cold storage, -20, what cleaning fluid can you use that won't actually freeze when you try and clean the facility? Then anyone who's studied public health is always told about the social determinants of health, and this really played out over and over in many different ways. So not only the essential workers, often the less well paid in the community, the ability to lobby for better conditions and better protection, obviously more difficult. A lot of them had more than one job and were working across multiple workplaces, and then therefore could see different sites of infection. And then just the household structure that they lived in, the accommodation, and even the transportation was often shared between a lot of these people, and that really changed, really affected their susceptibility to infection. So a lot of things that were put in place, trying to have pandemic leave so that people wouldn't lose income and wouldn't feel that they had to come to work. The JobKeeper, which obviously a Commonwealth initiative, and then just putting obligations on employers and employees to make sure that employers didn't obligate workers to come to work while they were unwell, and employers also had obligations to tell their employer if they had been tested or had tested unwell. The fourth lesson was really about the public health interventions. So in the second wave, you can see that all these things were put into place. The stage 3 restrictions were put into place, but then the growth of the cases continued, and it was only really with stage 4 restrictions that we managed to turn that around. The arrow there is actually the day I started work at the department, but noting that in epidemiology, correlation is not causation. There was many things that were put in place around then. I think we've become familiar with this concept of the effective reproductive rate. So below 1 means that it's the growth is falling. Above 1 means there's increased growth. You can see in the second wave around the middle there that just before the stage 2 restrictions, there was quite significant growth in the number of cases. And it was really only with stage 4 restrictions, even after introducing masks and stage 3 restrictions, that we're able to get that growth rate down and have a decrease in the number of cases. And just noting that many other countries were probably in a similar situation towards the end of July. We had 700 cases, and these two countries in Europe, so the UK and France, had a similar number of cases, and the trajectories obviously have been quite different since then. And the final lesson that we really learned was about scaling responses. So some advice that we got very early was about there's a doubling rate to this infection. We need to think in exponential terms, not only in linear terms, so that if we had one ward full of patients, we need to be prepared for, in 1 or 2 weeks, we need to be able to prepare for 2 wards of patients or 4 wards of patients the following week after. And that really applied not only to clinical care, obviously we never got quite to that stage, but also in the public health terms. So we were thinking, at one stage we were getting dozens of new outbreaks a day, and having a workforce that could respond to that was really important. So a lot of these issues have been largely addressed, but there's always this need for continuous improvement. So better engaging with community groups, the stand-up of these local public health units, both regional and metropolitan, having all these broader responses in the economy to make sure that the structural issues and worker mobility is reduced. Now that we don't have any cases, we really need to think about what are the things that need to be in place and what are we measuring to know that things are going off the rails, and then having a surge workforce that is available to respond. In terms of contact tracing, lots of things were put into place. There were call centres, so both a health workforce and a non-health workforce, to be able to contact people. If we couldn't find them, we would door knock. There was a call to test, so that if people couldn't get testing or weren't mobile enough to get to a testing centre, that we were able to go in to test them. There was a focus on case management, and more so now with trying to manage households as one unit. And then more recently, this contact of contacts approach, where we try and cast a very wide net around cases to make sure that there's no spread out. In terms of high-risk settings and populations, obviously the local public health units, there's an Aboriginal and multicultural contact tracing team dedicated to those communities. There have been many round tables with varying different cultural and linguistic groups, and with community organisations. There has been an aged care response centre that's been stood up with the Commonwealth to coordinate those responses between the Commonwealth and the state, and then dedicated operations for sensitive settings like public housing, for community engagements, and then for schools. And then finally, there's been this drive to try and improve the efficiency of notifications and process through rebuilding the electronic databases, and then measuring indicators to make sure that we're closing out case interviews and contact tracing within a good amount of time. And in terms of the future, obviously there's going to be a pivot towards prevention and trying to be on the front foot with testing, so surveillance testing in high-risk populations, such as people that work in hotel quarantine and meat works and aged care and so on. There's a lot of drive to do research to try and find better ways of doing testing, so using saliva instead of swabs, using antigen testing, much cheaper and quicker way of testing, maybe not quite as sensitive. And then there's also mobile testing vans to get tests to where they're needed quickly. There's been quite a lot of work now on wastewater testing, obviously with all the cases recently in Melbourne, that hasn't been quite so useful, but it's able to give us some reassurance that there are no active cases in an area, at least going back a few weeks. There's still now a bit of work going into hotel quarantine and the next model of how that will look, and then making sure that we have this surge capacity for public health, for hospitals and for personal protective equipment. And then hopefully in the nearish future we'll be starting to roll out a COVID immunisation program. So Australia does have a vaccine strategy, and it's built around these pillars. And this is really all the way from basic research out to putting needles in arms or vaccines up noses, depending on which vaccine we're going to get. Australia has signed up to the COVAX facility to supply vaccine globally to various countries, and has indicated support to Pacific Island nations, particularly around supporting their vaccine rollout. There is an Australian government task force dedicated to this at the moment, and there's two main committees: the Science and Industry Technical Advisory Group, which is advising on which investments government should make, and then the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, which is more about implementation. So in terms of the vaccine landscape, there are an enormous number of vaccine candidates out there, but actually a lot of these are still molecules in labs, and in terms of vaccines that are actually being formulated into syringes and for development, there's 11 vaccines in phase 3, and the major approaches are some of the traditional ones, and then sort of more modern ones that are as yet untested. So these are the four sort of major approaches. So the old way of making vaccines, we grow it in a lab and either kill it or attenuate it and then inject that. Obviously that's associated with all the issues about growing large amounts of a very dangerous virus, but it is a tried and true way of making vaccine. The protein subunit vaccines are much more sort of a modern, and again, there is a good track record in developing these vaccines, but they are relatively expensive and will require adjuvants to make sure that there's a sufficient immune response. And then the sort of the two new technologies are viral vector vaccines and the nucleic acid vaccines. The viral vector vaccines include the Oxford vaccine, and a recent example of that in humans is the dengue vaccine, as well as the Ebola vaccine was made through this way. But there are not many vaccines that have been made in this way. With the mRNA vaccines or the RNA vaccines, there aren't any examples in humans to date, but there are some animal vaccines in this space. So in terms of the vaccines that Australia has, just get back on, yep. So Australia has invested in 4 of these vaccines, 2 protein vaccines, the Novavax vaccine and the one that's being developed at the University of Queensland, one of the viral vector vaccines, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, and then this Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which is one of the RNA vaccines. And just noting that results or interim results have been announced, albeit by press release, for both the RNA vaccines recently, and they're looking fairly good. And I think the encouraging side of this is that they're all based on the spike protein of the virus, and that does suggest perhaps that if this is the immune response that will protect humans, that actually it's possible that all these vaccines may work quite well. In terms of having a vaccine is one thing, but actually getting into people's arms will be the next thing. And so ATAGI has stood up a number of working groups to work out what and who will be vaccinated, and then how we're going to be distributing this, and then managing those risks to make sure that it is safe. And obviously confidence is a really important part of this. So there are a large number of candidates out there, and Australia has invested in a number of different technologies. The first candidates are actually looking pretty good, but obviously there's going to be refinement to vaccines and they may improve over time. But we are going to need robust safety and risk management plans to make sure that they're safe and that people have confidence in this program. Optimistically, the newest vaccine may be not that far away. There's a lot of processes that are occurring in parallel, and probably by early next year we may have some vaccines, and clearly a lot of public expectations are quite high at the moment. So just sort of reflect on some of the personal things that have happened and I did wonder, at the in July, what use a hospital infection control doctor was going to do in public health, but actually a lot of the skills are probably similar. So hospital infection control actually isn't that unlike public health, just at a very small scale, and a lot of the principles are the same. So epidemiology being sort of drawing conclusions from very imperfect data and trying to work out what to do. And I think one of the major things working on the other side in government is people know all sorts of things about the virus. Some of them we know about, and some of them we hear about. But there are a lot of people that know a lot of things, and how do we translate what collectively we know into what we might do in government? And so the Burnett and the MCRI actually produced quite useful research synthesis reports where they took a lot of the evidence and said, okay, for this very difficult problem of schools, how should we approach that? What is the state of the art? How can we do this safely? There was certainly a lot of commission modelling to answer, again, thorny questions, and it was really very much a two-way dialogue to say, this is what what we think is possible within the policy framework. Now, what is the best option going forwards? And so this really does, I think, highlight a need for, CDC, maybe not in the United States sense, but an agency that really does provide technical support and evidence synthesis to try and synthesise everything out there to try and translate that into policy. In terms of a surge workforce, I think I'm one of many infectious diseases physicians that came into the department. There was a call out for physicians and many other specialists to come into the department to help, and though probably one of the more visible ones, there are probably dozens of physicians that are working in the department and slotting at all different levels in the department, from outbreak response up to policy, that have been really helpful. Working in government has been a very steep learning curve. I've learned that there are very complex structures, and it's we often see in the public just the announcement that's made at the end, but the process of policy development is probably not unlike sausage making. You don't always want to see how it's made, but a lot goes into that, and there's a lot of people within government that are thinking very carefully about problems. So I've learned sort of concepts about the authorising environment, so who is it within government that can develop policy and implement things. The Overton window is a concept about what you can talk about in polite society, in politics, but also this applies to public health. So things that we wouldn't have entertained doing, mandatory masks or closing borders, now seem fairly standard, but that's clearly a long way from where we came before. And there's no shortage of people trying to offer ideas about what we should be doing, and one of the learnings has been stopping bad ideas is almost as good as progressing good ideas to make sure that policy is sound. Oops, I think there might be a slide missing or something. Maybe the next slide. So, and then clearly I've drawn a lot of skills that I've had to by going into government, but clearly also drawing on a lot of unfamiliar skills. So public speaking is not my forte, and I think the media people described it as look, every time I went up at the beginning, it looked like I was going in front of the firing squad. And I think when politicians start offering sympathy, you're in a dangerous place. And we certainly didn't have many friends as a lot of this was being rolled out. There was criticism coming from obviously opposition in government, from other academics and from universities about why we weren't doing things the right way. But people say what they're going to say, and we take that into account, and we move on and try and do the best that we can. So I was reassured that I thought my job was reasonably difficult, but it was more difficult than for some others. I'm very glad that we have a relatively rational government compared to some others. So I'm not comparing myself with Tony Fauci by any ways, but I did in any way. But I did was interested in how he coped with the pushback from the public, and he did quote the Godfather in saying that it's not personal, it's only business. Opposition is always going to oppose, and people will always have their own read about things, and it's not something that you take personally. I think one thing that was this is another quote from the Godfather, and one thing that I'm grateful that the government did realise that this is a health problem, and all the other problems flow through once those health problems are solved. And that good health is more important than anything else, and they did prioritise that. And so finally, just to reflect that we are very lucky to still have jobs, and this has been an enormous stress on the community, but to be able to be part of trying to solve this problem, even though it's not anywhere near over yet, has been certainly very rewarding. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Alan. We've got some prepared questions that have been pre-submitted, but I just taking chair's privilege and asking one. One thing I found, as a health professional, but I know the public has been perplexed by, is how supposedly credible epidemiologists from all around the world, which you would imagine are all looking at the same data, can come up with such vastly different modelling. Sweden, for example, in Scandinavia is a classic, who go for the concept of herd immunity from the outset, whether it's Scandinavian neighbours said, no, we're going for social lockdown, etc. So how is it such incredibly diverse opinions can come up when supposedly everyone's got the same piece of data in their hands?
I guess I go back to that, principle that epidemiology is the art of, drawing conclusions from very imperfect data, and particularly very early on, we had very imperfect data, and so, modelling, for example, there were all sorts of wildly diverging estimates. I think, part of that is, clearly there's part of, what does the data show, and that's one thing. I think part of the other thing is that every country works within a context. So, closing borders was something that, we could do relatively easily in Australia, but, and in the Pacific, it's been a very effective tool. But for other countries, Canada with a large land border with the United States, it'd be very, very difficult to do. So, and Europe, they have their own, impediments to closing borders within the EU. So I think, it's a very, there's, what does the evidence show, which is obviously disputed and subject to interpretation, and then what is the context in which you're working in, and that's a whole new context that makes policy development difficult.
Question? Any more from the audience before we move to our list?
So, how well was our response to this informed by responses to previous pandemics, and how would that predicate, if you like, our response to the next pandemic and what we've learned from this one?
Yeah, it's difficult to know. So, in 2009, so influenza is basically unstoppable. Actually, maybe not now that we've learned what's happened this year, but in 2009, it was sort of well and truly on us before we had a chance to do anything. Its incubation period is, 1 day or 2 days. You've got very little opportunity to put any public health actions in place. A lot of transmission occurs before symptoms onset, so it's really hard to identify who can. And I think that it sort of informed some of the Swedish way of thinking. They thought, well, maybe this is going to be the same, also sort of unstoppable. So I think there are elements that are learned from other things. We had an influenza pandemic plan, and we're able to sort of pivot that to adapt it to things, but there are things that we learn that are different about this, that closing borders being an effective tool, I think was something that we learned. Masks probably being somewhat effective, also is sort of an important learning from this that may not have worked in other pandemics in the past.
Thanks, Alan, and congratulations on your leadership, right from the very beginning within this hospital to the more recently, obviously, across the state. Putting your crystal ball in front of you, with the vaccines about to be being implemented, where do you see the future in 12 months' time, 24 months' time? From what I understand, elimination is not considered a realistic strategy for vaccination. So the virus will still be amongst us, and there'll still be those that are vulnerable. Are we going to be wearing masks in 12, 14, 24 months, or social distancing? Where do you see the next few years?
It's really difficult because there's a whole lot of different paths, and a lot of them depend on the characteristics of the vaccine. So the first question is, does the vaccine just prevent against infection? Does it prevent against severe infection, or does it actually stop any transmission at all? So, does it give you sterilising immunity and you're not infectious at all? I think it would be a very, I think 3/4 of the deaths have occurred in people that are in residential aged care in Victoria. So if we had a vaccine that basically stopped people dying, and then there is the issue of long COVID and other potential issues. But if we had a vaccine that sort of just stopped all the severe things, then it becomes the flu, and it's a very different disease. If we have the potential to stop transmission altogether, then the way we might roll out the vaccine might be slightly different. Protecting key workers and people that might transmit becomes important, and then we have a chance to really try and maximise herd immunity in the traditional sense to stop transmission. Unfortunately, what will probably happen is that firstly, it's not going to be a perfect vaccine. So 90% is pretty good, and that's probably better than we might have hoped, but there's still going to be some failure rate. Secondly, that it's not likely that we will be able to vaccinate 7 billion people in the world in 1 or even 2 or 3 years, if ever. So making sure that the vaccine is available to all is going to be really important, but there will always be that threat of introduction from outside. So I'm not really sure what public health control will look like in a year, but it depends on what the disease looks like post-vaccine. And I think that's going to be an important thing going forward.
Alan, has your experience in government and the way government makes policy development and so on, has that changed how you think about leadership for you here?
Yeah, look, I think, one thing that's been given me a lot of confidence in government is that there are an enormous number of people. It's a huge organisation, and there's so many people that are so expert in their field. And that's not unlike a hospital. You know who to go to for different things. What is different in government, and having been there all of 6 months, is that I'm still contacted by people who have no idea who they are or what their job is, and even sometimes the title on the bottom of their email doesn't actually help me what the Department of Intergovernmental Relations does within government, but is a very big and important part of government. So I think it's about how do you get things done in government, how do you make sure that the right stakeholders around the table, sort of developing developing policies carefully and in consultation with other people. I think that's what that's taught me, and that's something that is obviously important in any large organisation, including a hospital.
So Alan, this pandemic has occurred in the context of the information revolution and access to information. And as you know, there's been a lot of misinformation. What role do you think the public health and clinical community have in addressing the misinformation? You put the slide up there of one of the leaders of misinformation. How do we, that seems to me to be one of the new challenges that we have. So it's not necessarily about just understanding the data or the disease, it's actually about what other people are putting out.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two bits of it. There's sort of the crazy people, and for want of a better word, in fringe, people that have alternative beliefs and so on. And then there's, I guess, in the United States where they're sort of part of government, and that makes it even more difficult. I mean, I think, and again, this sort of goes back to Chris's point. People do respect experts, and maybe that's a bit unusual about Australia at the moment, but I am reassured that, when I say something or when experts say something, people actually do believe that, and that does carry a lot of weight. So I think it is incumbent on us that are looking at evidence to know, firstly, what do we think is the right thing to do, and why, to explain why public health measures might be the way they are, and also to some extent to recognise the limits of our knowledge, to say we don't know this yet, and therefore we need to do more research, or to watch that that piece of evidence more carefully, or I'm not an expert in this, but I will ask someone that will know, and I think that's really important as well. But particularly in this age of social media, having credible voices out there is really important, I think.
Okay, well, we've been inundated with pre-submitted questions, so Renee's going to do the honours of reading some of those.
You've already touched on some of these questions, but it's worth perhaps going back into a little bit. The first one is really a bit of a welfare check for you.
Yeah.
Personal reflections as the Deputy CEO, Deputy CHO. What it's really like to work in the world that you work in at the moment.
Yeah, it's been a very steep learning curve, I have to say, and I'm really grateful to my public health colleagues for their patience in sort of holding my hand through this, and not saying that I'm saying silly things all the time. I think a lot of things really just come back to trying to come back to first principles, to say, why are we doing something? Who needs to know about this? What is the process to get this sorted out, or to come up with a policy? It certainly has been a pretty wild ride. Lots of late night meetings and phone calls, and a week and a half ago when we were, a couple of weeks ago now, when we had to pause the sort of relaxation plan by a day, just to make sure that everything was going okay up in East Preston. That's to tell the Premier that no, the plan is not on today is a pretty big thing for someone like me. So I'm very grateful to everyone for really helping out with a lot of that. And it certainly is reassuring to have that machinery of government behind you to say, this is the way things get sorted out.
What is the evidence for super spreader people or events?
Yeah, so that absolutely is a feature of this illness, and it's not. I think rather not say that they're super spreader people, because that sort of says it's the person, but it actually is the person, the time that where they are in their illness, the situation that they find themselves in, how many people are around them. So it is about super spreading events, and they do seem to be very very important in this illness. We've certainly had people that have been infectious in a particular situation, and don't get any cases coming out of that. So as an example, in aged care, I think 40% of aged care outbreaks were actually just one case. So someone worked infectious in an aged care facility, nothing happened. And then obviously we've had aged care facilities where there've been hundreds of infections. So that really just emphasises that sort of heterogeneity and infectiousness that we're still, I think, understanding to some extent, but does relate to sort of situation and the characteristics of the infection.
You talked a bit about the 4 different vaccine options. There's a question here about compare and contrast the 4 vaccine options that Australia is considering, particularly in respect to the safety benefits, efficacy and storage issues.
Yeah, so they're different technologies, so that's one encouraging thing, that one could work and another one may not for various reasons, and they will probably arrive at different times. So some of For example, the University of Queensland vaccine will probably be a little bit slower because it's still going through development, whereas some of the mRNA vaccines, which are easier to make, will probably come out first. There are significant challenges, and they're all different in their own ways, but an obvious issue is about the issue of some of the mRNA vaccines needing to be stored at -80, so that's not a freezer that we have floating around. As an example, the Ebola vaccine had to be stored at -80, and in West Africa, that's no mean feat, and they were able to roll out a vaccine campaign successfully in West Africa against Ebola. So everything is possible. It just takes a bit of ingenuity and a lot of money, I'd imagine. Yeah.
How confident are you that any asymptomatic cases smouldering in the community, especially amongst the disadvantaged, have been detected by testing and contact tracing? And then as a follow-up, are we at risk from cases in New South Wales and perhaps now South Australia?
Yeah. So the sort of the three things that we're always worried about are incursion from another jurisdiction, an escape out of hotel quarantine, which we don't have at the moment, obviously, or something that we don't know about in the community. And I think as time goes on, and now we're, 16 days without any reported cases, we are becoming more confident that there probably isn't any community transmission. We also have other sort of lines of evidence that help us with that. So there has been active testing of people in high-risk workplaces, and then we have wastewater testing to look to see if there's anything in sewage. And there's nothing really unexpected coming up in sewage. So now that means that we need to turn our attention to the borders, and clearly, with South Australia, we're keeping a very close eye on that situation, which is changing daily. And then with hotel quarantine, we need to have the settings that are in place to make sure that that's as safe as it possibly can. But recognising, like South Australia, things can happen, and that's happened in New Zealand as well, where they've got everything in place, but it's an infectious virus, and even despite best efforts, things can happen.
Why were we not prepared for a pandemic?
Oh, look, preparedness is a continuum. I think it would be not fair to say that we weren't prepared at all. But I think, like a lot of emergency services, or emergency management, if you don't use it, it does tend, you do need to keep practicing it. I think Queensland tell us that they're quite used to dealing with emergencies. They have a cyclone every year, and they get to practice their emergency management structures each year. Obviously, in Victoria, bushfires and so on are a common occurrence. But this is, health emergencies, and particularly ones that go on for, months at a time, are unusual and are particularly complicated. So, reaching into all parts of government. So that's, I think, something that is a particular challenge with the pandemic.
We've had a couple of questions come in from the live stream. A question about contact tracing. With contact tracing in Victoria, did it improve, or was it just easier to do when case numbers dropped off? Or a bit of both?
It was a bit of both. I think when I started the department, one of my first sort of realisations was that any solution that we came up with, when we're having 500, 700 cases a day, basically everything would break if we got to 1,000 cases or 2,000 cases a day, and everything would be much easier if we only had 100 cases a day to deal with, and that certainly was true. But that's not to say that we didn't put a whole lot of things in place. So there really were, I made a list, and it was about a page long of all the different changes that were made, and some of them I outlined today, sort of focusing on that process and a lot of it is incremental, trying to get that test turnaround time as short as it can be, so that people don't have to wait for 5 days for a test. They can just wait 1 day, and they'll get the result by the end of the day. Again, it becomes easier when you have smaller numbers, but there were a lot of improvements to get to that point. Then making sure that we closed out the interview quickly, that the contact tracers were trained, and then we could get to their contacts, and so there were benchmarks set, and we measured them to say, okay, how long is it taking to get to this? What can we do better? And a lot of it, like in hospitals, quality improvement is sort of a game of percentages, small increments to try and improve things. And then there was this real focus on high risk industries and settings. So there were whole operations that were set up to look at public housing, to work better with community and to have better community engagement, and then some of these special task forces, and then really just making sure that we're measuring everything to improve on everything that we could improve on.
Another one from the live stream. Given that mask wearing began about 2 weeks before we went into stage 4 lockdown, can we see the specific impact of mask wearing on the infection rate in wave 2?
I think in public health it's always really difficult to sort of tease out one intervention from another. I think it probably did have an impact, and I think Burnett actually have quantified that to say that probably reduced infectivity by sort of about 15 or 20%. But I think, it's always difficult to tease it out because we could see, for example, that mobility through road traffic data and public transport data was continuing to fall. So it's hard to say, okay, this is about how much is due to masks, and this is how much due to that, further reduction in mobility. But where we were at the end of just before stage 4 was that each infection was generating one other case, and at that sort of rate, control isn't possible. We're just going to have the same numbers forever. So we really need to get that down further, and that's sort of why we had to move to stage 4 lockdown. And obviously, it's a huge decision to do that. But the idea behind it was really to say we just want to do this for as short as time as possible. So what's the hardest we can lock down just to get this down, and then we can reopen, and we are thankfully where we are now.
So just on from that, Alan, you have to be pessimistic about Europe and the US as they currently sit, and it seems a very piecemeal approach with very short windows of lockdown, and it seems to be the duration of lockdown in Melbourne really was the aspect that broke its back.
Yeah, the hardest. I think it wasn't particularly, it wasn't that controversial to start lockdown. I think where we got the most pressure is actually towards the end, where the smaller number of cases. Everyone's worried about masks, and we don't. Why we're wearing masks and there's no cases. It's just that last little bit where you're trying to be careful and not risk a resurgence is the hard bit to keep everyone on board with, and certainly that was probably most of our pushback was around that time. I suspect that the US is really off the scale in terms of the numbers of infections, but it's not just one big country. It's there's lots of states and cities, and I think what New York has shown is that it is possible, but it is going to be difficult, and it is going to have probably be for more than a couple of weeks to allow things to get to a smaller number.
It sort of follows on a little bit from Terry's question, this one. Assuming community transmission continues to remain under control nationally, what do you think are the biggest health and healthcare challenges facing Australians in relation to the direct or indirect consequences of COVID-19 in the years ahead?
Look, that's a huge question, and I think that's going to be really difficult. I think there's clearly been, COVID has a lot of indirect effects, so, people not coming forward for preventive health. I remember very early on, there was, in the first lockdown, there was modelling to say, if we had to shut down breast screen or, all the other screening programs, how many cancers would arise as a consequence of that. And obviously that number is small compared to, what potentially COVID could have done. But that is a number, and it is important. So we do really need to make sure that, preventive health services, public health, are maintained through all of this. And then the other major impact obviously is on mental health. So we've not seen an increase in suicide, thankfully, but suicide is not, all of mental health, and there's certainly a lot of measurable impacts on mental health, and that is going to be something that needs to be addressed. And then finally, there's been a lot of impact on just broader society and the economy and so on. So, and that's going to also have impacts on health, and particularly mental health of younger people. So all of that's going to be really important going forward.
We might have time for a couple more questions, you think, Steve? One or two more? So I'm sure that nobody really wants to be going international at the moment, as things are across the world. But when hopefully things are more under control, how can Australia reopen safely to international tourism?
That's a really difficult question that's exercising the minds of the Commonwealth at the moment, all of us at the moment. So, I mean, I think there is always international travel to some degree. So, transport and trade and people going home for compassionate reasons and so on. So the question is sort of how can we increase that volume, bring in international students again, bring back Australians overseas. I think the hope is that we will have travel bubbles to start with. So New Zealand obviously is the first one for us, where we're allowing New Zealanders to come in without needing quarantine. And there's the potential perhaps for other Pacific Island nations to do that. Then the next thought will be, what other countries, particularly in Asia, that don't have many cases, might that risk be acceptable? And it may not be. It may be a sort of a cut-down version of quarantine, or it may be, quarantine at home in an alternative place rather than in a hotel. But I think that's sort of the sort of general thinking about the way things are going.
I just think it was very respectful of our audience not to ask you who made the decision to put the security guards in the quarantine hotels. So you jumped that one.
Well and truly before my time.
So I'd just like to thank you for a fantastic overview. I don't think any of us envy your responsibilities having to front the media pack on a semi-daily basis, but I know we're all very, very grateful for the time you've invested. Many hours, I'm sure, and I think, as I said, the result speaks for itself. We've done it hard, but the outcome has been, I think, world-leading. So thank you very much for your efforts and your talk today. Fantastic. All right. So just to finish up today is the awarding of the prizes for research for the precinct for the year, and this is traditionally awarded to a basic science publication and a clinical research publication that have been published in the highest impact factor journal in the preceding year. This year we had a tie for the basic research publication, and you couldn't get a much better tie because both articles published in the premier international journal Nature. So the first one, the title of the research was Treatment of Type 2 Diabetes with the designer cytokine IC7FC, and Dr. Tamara Allen from the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute is the recipient of this as the first author of the publication. A lot of authors, so Tamara, one of the first authors, and Mark Fabreo, the senior author from Monash. So I think we have a presentation and acceptance speech. Tamara?
I'm Tamara Allen from the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute. I would like to start by saying thank you for this award. It is an honour to be recognised for this research and publishing our work in Nature. Type 2 diabetes is highly prevalent worldwide, and despite several well-established drug classes for treating it, there still remains an unmet need for drugs that halt or reverse disease progression. The GP130 receptor cytokines IL-6 and CNTF have both been found to improve metabolic homeostasis, but both have limited therapeutic use. They act by binding to the IL-6 or CNTF receptor and then signal through a GP130 receptor homodimer or GP130 lift receptor heterodimer. In this paper, we describe the creation of a chimeric GP130 ligand, termed IC7, made by removing one GP130 receptor binding site from IL-6 and replacing it with a lift receptor binding site from CNTF, and then fusing with an FC domain from IgG. This creates a cytokine with CNTF-like but IL-6 receptor-dependent signaling. When administered to high-fat fed mice, IC7FC decreases body mass, fat mass, and liver fat while improving glucose tolerance and increasing hepatic fatty acid oxidation and AMPK activity. It decreases food intake, preferentially reduces fat mass, and increases energy expenditure while maintaining or increasing muscle mass through the activation of YAP1 in skeletal muscle cells. The observation that skeletal muscle mass is preserved in the presence of reduced nutrient intake is crucial because increased muscle mass reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes. IC7FC also increases insulin and C-peptide, indicating it acts as an insulin secretagogue. Indeed, IC7FC effects were found to be reliant on the presence of a functional pancreas. Further examination found IC7FC increases insulin action by stimulating incretin secretion and action in the gut and pancreas respectively, leading to lower glucose levels and increased glucose uptake into brown adipose tissue. IC7FC also increases circulating glucagon. This unique combination of increased glucagon and incretin response was effective at avoiding hypoglycemic events in animal models, an attribute that is uncommon in most existing drugs. In addition, female IC7FC transgenic animals have increased GIP and bone density, an additional positive effect given the risk of bone fracture is increased in type 2 diabetes, and some drugs used to treat type 2 diabetes increase skeletal fragility. Lastly, IC7FC was further examined in macaque monkeys and human PBMCs and is found to be safe with no signs of inflammatory or immunogenic responses. In summary, to our knowledge, there are no current drugs used to treat type 2 diabetes that have these multiple positive benefits to overall health and metabolism, making IC7FC a potentially viable and realistic biological therapy to treat type 2 diabetes and muscle atrophy.
The co-winner is a paper entitled An Integrative Systems Genetic Analysis of Mammalian Lipid Metabolism, as I mentioned, also published in Nature. Anna Kalkin is the first author on publication, and she's here. And this is from the Baker Heart Diabetes Institute. Congratulations.
Thank you for this award, which I'm delighted to accept on behalf of my co-authors. It's wonderful to receive recognition for all our hard work for this manuscript, which was published in Nature earlier last year. I'm Associate Professor Anna Kalkin from the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute, and I'm going to share with you some of our key findings. So fatty liver disease is a condition that affects 1 in 5 individuals, in particular those over the age of 50. It's characterised by accumulation of fat in the liver, and is a progressive disease that can increase the risk of heart disease, diabetes, and liver cancer. However, there are no effective therapeutic treatments for this condition. And so we wanted to understand hepatic lipid metabolism to see if we could identify a novel therapeutic target for this disease. So we took over 100 strains of genetically diverse mice, and in replicate animals from each strain, we performed plasma and liver lipidomics and liver proteomic analysis. Upon integration of these different data sets, we were able to identify novel lipid signatures in the plasma that reflected the accumulation of toxic lipids in the liver. And we went on to validate these findings in a human cohort. We performed lipid protein correlations and identified novel associations between these two. We utilised the proteomic data to predict the localization of different proteins. And finally, we performed genetic mapping to identify novel loci associated with different plasma and liver lipids. One of the targets that we identified using this approach was a protein called PSMD9. We then went on to perform validation studies and using an adenovirus, we overexpressed PSM-D9 in the livers of mice from 2 different strains and demonstrated that this was associated with an increase in liver abundance in both the liver and the plasma of mice. Importantly, we were interested in understanding whether attenuating PSM-D9 would have therapeutic potential in the context of fatty liver disease. So we then went on to use antisense oligonucleotides to target PSM-D9 and treated mice while concurrently feeding them a Western diet high in fat and cholesterol. This was associated with a robust attenuation of PSM-D9, as well as a reduction in markers of the de novo lipogenesis pathway, a key synthesis pathway in the liver. This was also associated with a marked reduction of plasma and liver lipids and a reduced propensity for mice to gain weight. And finally, we showed that this was associated with an improvement in liver pathology. And we're now pursuing this as a therapeutic target for fatty liver disease. As you can imagine, this is a huge tour de force involving people from many different institutes, which I've listed down here. But in particular, I wanted to acknowledge Associate Professor Brian Drew from the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute, who was a co-lead on this manuscript. And finally, just to highlight that this manuscript's had over 28,000 accesses since it was published earlier last year and over 29 citations already. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, Karen. Congratulations. Wonderful work. So the winner of the Clinical Research Award is a paper entitled Association of HIV Pre-Exposure Prophylaxis with Incidence of Sexually Transmitted Infection among individuals at high risk of HIV infection, published again in the stellar journal JAMA. And the first author for this publication was Michael Traeger, senior author Edwina Wright from the Burnett Institutes and Monash.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much. It's really great to be acknowledged for this fantastic award for our paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, early last year. My name is Michael Traeger. I'm a PhD student at the Burnett Institute. However, this research was really the product of a large team, the PrEP study, from many partner organizations as well, so including Alfred, Monash, the Vic government, and Thorn Harbour Health, among others. So the PrEP study was a large implementation study, one of the largest of its kind in the world, which was rolled out in 2016 to 2018 and provided the HIV prevention drug, pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, to more than 4,200 individuals at risk of HIV across Victoria. So while PrEP is highly effective at preventing HIV, it has no effect on other STIs. So one of the big burning questions among researchers and clinicians internationally was whether the use of PrEP increased the risk of other STIs. So while there are many different outcomes of the PrEP study, this is the question that we tried to address in our paper. So to do this, we conducted a longitudinal analysis of STI outcomes. Specifically, we looked at chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis among just under 3,000 PrEP participants, the vast majority of them gay and bisexual men. And using our world-class sentinel surveillance system for STIs in Australia, Access, we were able to overcome some major methodological flaws present in other studies. So without going too much into the methods of the paper, some of the main findings we reported, we detected 2,892 STIs during just over 3,000 person years of follow-up during the study. And this gave an incidence rate of 91.9 per 100 person years, so relatively high rate of STIs compared to non-PrEP users. An interesting result we found that was half of participants were not diagnosed with an STI, and in fact, STIs were highly concentrated among a subgroup of participants. So just a quarter of participants accounted for 3/4 of all STIs in our study. Then we conducted a survival analysis and Cox regression, and we found that younger age, greater number of partners, and participation in group sex were strong indicators of STI risk. And then probably the most important finding was that when we did a data linkage to look at participants' STI diagnoses before enrolling in the study, we found that STI incidence increased by about 21% from before to during PrEP use, even after adjusting for the change in testing frequency. So this was really the first analysis of a large cohort of PrEP users, which was able to compare STI outcomes before and after PrEP use, and to detect this increase in risk without some major biases present. So the analysis reinforces that PrEP users are a priority population for STIs, and highlights that prevention strategies should include regular and sustained asymptomatic testing of PrEP users, and they also support Australia's current guidelines for quarterly STI testing. So finally, I'd just like to thank my supervisors and the senior authors of the paper, Associate Professor Edwina Wright and Professor Mark Stubbe. Thanks again.
Well, it brings proceedings to a close. Just again to thank Renee and her team for doing all the organisation, and to thank everybody for their attendance this afternoon.
Just done there. Send it to the Chairman's office.
Edit the narrative.